All right, we're getting ready to start the next area for week 2, which is fingerprints. You've had significant training on fingerprints, from classification to processing to identification during your lower level courses. So this should be just a basic overview for all of you. Just a brief history. You should know by now that identification started with anthropometry, developed by a French police clerk by the name of Alphonse Bertillon, who is known as the father of modern identification. As fingerprinting evolved and became recognized, he added fingerprints to his anthropometry system. Another historical person in the field of fingerprinting was Dr. William Fuld, who served as a missionary doctor in Japan, and in the 1880 he published a book about fingerprints. Had a story in there about how latent prints were left on a wall and did not match the an initial suspect, but several days later they determined to give a match to a second suspect, who eventually admitted to the crime. Fuld had offered to set up a research lab at Scotland Yard to study fingerprints to be used in criminal cases, but at that time the people in charge rejected his offer, believing anthropometry was a better tool for identification. The loop, of course, is the most common fingerprint. About 65% of the population has loops, and a loop is defined by having two typed lines that run parallel and diverge. They have a recurving ridge, at least one recurving ridge. And they have a delta, which could be a short ridge or any type of ridge, and they have a core. This would be your core right in here, and there has to be a ridge count of at least 1. So we don't count the delta, as you know, and we go from here, imaginary line, to the core, and we don't count the core, but this would be a ridge count of 2. So it meets the criteria for being a loop, as it has more than 1 ridge count. The next pattern we have is the whorl, named so because it has a sort of a circular or a whirlpool pattern in the center of the finger. There's 4 types. There's the plain whorl, the central pocket loop whorl, the double loop whorl, and the accidental whorl. You know that the whorl has 2 deltas, one on each side of the print in various locations, that tend to surround the pattern area. And we do not count loops, but we trace loops. We trace from the left side to the right side, and the tracing is either a inner tracing, a meeting tracing, or an outer tracing. And you guys should have had a lot of practice of that, so you should not have any problem classifying loops and doing the tracings. And the third primary pattern is the arch. It's the most common, or not common, but simplest pattern to identify. But it's the one that is only 5% of the population have arches on their fingers. There's two types of arch, and it's basically it flows from it's ridges that flow from one side of the finger to the other side without recurving ridges or circular patterns. So a plain arch would just be like going up a hill and back down to the other side. A tented arch would be more of a steep incline and with sort of a thrusting up to the center. Could even have a like a tent pole in the middle, and that would be the difference between your plain arch and your tented arch. As fingerprinting evolved back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, several people were involved in trying to determine or discover classification systems. One was a Sir Edward Richard Henry of Great Britain, and then there was Dr. Juan Guptovich system in Argentina. The Henry system became used in Europe and India, and then eventually in the United States. Guptovich's system was adopted by South American countries. The system is a very involved system, requiring a unbelievable amount of work to develop the classification for each person's set of fingers, and you've had training on that, so you know how in depth that is. And we also know that due to movement into technology and digital imaging, that although we still need a basic knowledge of the Henry system, we've moved on to another system that fits the digital world called the NCI system. Remembering that fingerprints were discovered and classification system put in place in Great Britain and then adopted throughout Europe. It did not arrive into the United States in 1904 when Scotland Yard sent one of their investigators, detectives, to present fingerprints at the 1904 World's Fair held in St. Louis. And this inspector taught police chiefs and law enforcement officials about the use of fingerprinting to solve criminal cases. He also stayed behind after the World's Fair to teach fingerprinting, classification, and identification to U.S. law enforcement investigators, uh, and eventually there was a case at Fort Leavenworth Prison where they had, using the anthropometry, the body measurement system developed by Bertillon, uh, which resulted in the release of the wrong person. Two prisoners with similar names, Will and William West, uh, were one that was accidentally released instead of the one that was supposed to be released. So they started implementing the fingerprinting system, and the start for the database of fingerprinting came from all the prisoners in Fort Leavenworth who were fingerprinted by U.S. personnel along with the Scotland Yard representative. And then along comes World War II, and that went on further to develop our databases. Military personnel were fingerprinted, and it also was used in civil service, government jobs at the state, federal, local levels. One in New York, it was common for people to pay others to take their written exams, and then they would, the actual applicant would then appear for the job after they had passed. The head of the agency caught on to that, and he started implementing fingerprinting of the applicant at the time they were made application, and then he compared their fingerprints at the time they were offered the job to see if it was the same person, and it was effectively used to screen out those people who had paid others to fraudulently take the civil service test for them. Classifying fingerprints, as I mentioned earlier, we used to depend on the Henry fingerprint classification system, but due to technology and automation, the FBI over a number of years, combined with other countries, developed a automated fingerprint identification system known as APIS. Um, the Henry system remains as the foundation for in-depth learning of fingerprint characteristics. That's why you've been taught it in your lower level classes. But the Henry system, as we talked about earlier, is very cumbersome and was difficult to be translated into the digital world. So we now have the NCIC classification system, which is the Bureau of the abbreviation for the National Criminal Identification Center. That's the criminal record and fingerprint database maintained by the FBI. So it makes it a lot easier for to capture and store and classify fingerprints. Fingerprints can be developed at the scene of a crime on doors, windows, television sets, computers, and then sometimes there's small items that can be that may be difficult to process in the field, which can be collected using, of course, the chain of custody and transported back to the lab for further processing. And that processing can include brush and powder, iodine fuming, super gluing, chemical sprays such as anhydrine or other physical developers. Sometimes fingerprints can be rendered visible with the use of alternate light sources, and that can be used both in the field and in the lab. Some mediums that are used to preserve fingerprint is the tape, like Scotch tape, the tape that we have, the rolls of tape. You can lift fingerprints with microsil, which is a putty-like substance, as well as close-up photography. Now, or also known as, in that case, evidence photography. You should know by now that if a fingerprint may be destroyed by lifting in whichever manner, it is highly recommended that you take a photograph of the fingerprint before you attempt to lift in order to preserve a print for identification purposes. If you destroy the print and don't have a picture of it, you've just lost a potential piece of evidence. So don't forget about photographing fingerprints on the scene if there's maybe an issue with being able to lift a print without destroying it. For those who are going into have thoughts about going into the field of fingerprint identification and classification and comparison, there's a little process that it's a standard process that latent print examiners go through. It's called ACE-V, ACE-V process. It stands for analysis, analyzing the fingerprints, comparing the unknown prints to known prints or suspect prints or exemplars, doing the evaluation of the minutia within the print that tells you as the latent print examiner that you've individualized the print from the scene to the specific person whose standards you're viewing. But after you do that, your findings need to be verified independently by another latent print examiner. And this assists you in validating your findings so that it's just a follow-up by another examiner to lend credibility to your findings. So when it's questioned, if it is ever questioned in court, you have two people that can show agreement on the comparison that was made. Being a latent print examiner requires a lot of additional training than you've already had. A lot of work just doing fingerprint classifications before you move into being a latent print examiner, and the identification associations have various standards that they require for people to go through to pass various testing courses and testing levels so that they can be court recognized as a latent print expert for court purposes.